So we changed the Planning Act. I won't go into all the details, but to provide for what's called a core strategy. So you've got a county development plan, but you've now got to have a core strategy, which is written in like one chapter. These are the core principles, ideas, and all the rest of the plan. The transport, the environment, the heritage part, social facilities, everything else has got to conform with the core strategy. And a key part of the core strategy is the population targets that get set for whatever the planning area is, whether it's a county, whether it's a city, whether it's a town, whatever the plan is.
And those targets are based on what? Natural growth or political ideology?
What happened is we at the national level set the targets for the 8 regions into which the country is set up. In fact, it was my job, that's what I did, set the targets for the 8 regions, was one of the things I did. And what then happened is that, say in a region there might be, I don't know, 8 counties. Those counties had to then have population targets which matched the total for the region, because what we were finding, and I had experienced the same thing here, if you added up the local area targets, like we would have as many people as Germany, you know, like sitting in Ireland. It's like loony stuff. So we set the targets nationally, and we said to all the planning authorities.
You set them on the basis of very realistic growth expectations, based on the existing trends for each area, presumably.
Plus the National Spatial Strategy policy, where it was trying to emphasize more growth in some areas with gateways and stuff like that.
But you wouldn't do something in a city like, you know, pick an area miles away from Dublin, to say, let's push everything out and stop Dublin. So it was a combination of the existing trends, some policy, and finding the kind of balancing out there, but much more realistic targets.
But with a level of excess population, because we wanted to actually give a level of flexibility, but not too much.
But what I find interesting is that you talk about your plan sets targets, rather than what's been happening here is that everybody does their own population extrapolation, each one based on some kind of spurious growth rate in many cases.
And you see, we have in the development plan, you have a housing strategy and you have a retail strategy. And the kind of numbers now all start having to add up. And so we set the national population targets, as we call them targets. The regional level has to adopt those. They've got to know to the chart. I mean, you've got to have to the number. You know, you've got to adopt what we set at the national level. The counties, which are within the regions, have to add up to exactly the same number as for that region. Within a county, if there's local towns and all together, they've got to add up to the county. So it goes right the way down into the ground.
So what we call alignment has to work all the way through the system.
All the way through the system. And those population targets don't just get set for the amount of zoned land that we end up having, but actually it goes into the retail strategy, the housing strategy. They take it into account in the environmental assessments that are done. It filters right through the system. And it's a level of discipline which wasn't there.
But your identification of targets or potential growth rates, whichever one wants to use them, you then have to have fairly detailed information in order to establish what those kind of growth targets or rates are going to be. Whereas, if I just compare it here, and I think of the kind of what we have, what we call the spatial development frameworks, each little place does its own particular sort of target, sort of projection, and does what you were saying, is everybody wants to grow faster than Kempton Park did at the height of its growth rate, So you've got everybody putting up sort of growth rates of 15% per annum. Everybody wants to have a Disney World, everybody wants to have a regional shopping centre, and so you go up the
It was
line.
the same in Ireland.
Yeah, this is what you're saying with that. But what you're saying now, that there's an attempt to be much more realistic, but you're setting it at the top, but it does have an enormous assumption that you have the expertise, number one, to the information in which to do that. Because I think this kind of bottom-up game that's happening here is that relatively few planners, I would argue, actually do realistic population targeting. At best, they take the trend of last year and say that it's going to go on ad infinitum until the next millennium, which is madness. So there's an assumption is that you do have the information to do that. I don't think that we're in a position to quite get there yet, except for maybe big places like Etikweni might have some expertise to do that. But Livingstone, near Jeffreys Bay, would certainly not have that real expertise to do that, and you get this kind of crazy stuff going.
Okay, when one of the first jobs I got in 1971 was looking at the 1970 population census. I was into cohort survival, projections, and all this more complicated kind of stuff. I've been through all that. The future is just too unpredictable, and the further you go out, the more the fan and scenarios goes like this. And I then came, in my own mind, even while I was here, back to the position that you could spend ages arguing here, there, everywhere. You need more data, you need this, that, and the other. At the end of the day, the levels of uncertainty into the future are so big, and they can have such divergent impacts, that you actually adopt a fairly simple, straightforward approach. Now, I represent the department on the Central Statistics Office National Committee, which looks at national population projections, national labour projections, and regional projections. I sit on this committee. Oh, this is being recorded. I sit on this committee, and the arguments are like you're arguing on the head of a pin. This, like the guys around the table, they argue about nuanced kind of stuff. And my contribution at every damn meeting is you can't seriously project to 2041 with any level of certainty. That's the one point. So pull the time period of the projection much closer. And secondly, you can really only talk about scenarios. And at the end of the day, wasting your time talking about this nuanced debate about the structure and how many women in this particular group, and if there's a change of fertility in the 20 to 25-year-old women's group, it's going to, getting that stuff. It's irrelevant, actually. Anyway, I don't win out all the time, so they carry on doing.
How do they feel about blowing telling you what to do?
No, I've been, personally, I feel I've been extremely well accepted. I've represented Ireland.
Do they feel you're neutral?
In the European, no, I've represented Ireland in the European Commission, where you've got all the translators and all the countries, and I'm sitting there. In that stage, like I had a South African passport, I had to get a visa to go to Brussels. And I'm sitting there having to get a visa to get to Brussels representing Ireland, with all these countries and all translation services going on, and there's me sitting there with a visa. I'm not even an Irish citizen. I am now, actually. There's my Irish passport, but I've got dual citizenship. But
what are you doing then in terms of your population projections, targeting? You're doing a fairly coarse grain.
Coarse grain, yeah. Because you don't need a hell of a lot of information to do a coarse grain, because there's so many uncertainties coming towards you. Part of what I did is I analysed the projections by the Central Statistics Office going back, from 1990. They were doing projections every period, and I looked at them and I compared them with what the actual population then became. And anybody who's done that kind of exercise, I'm sure you'll come to the same conclusion. You can be 15-20% easily. You know, like you're just wasting your time trying to get too much data and too sophisticated in the way you go about doing these kind of projections. The key thing is that they are relatively realistic and they're the best that you could do given the current data in this situation. The key thing is to have the political will to drive those numbers through the system. That's actually the issue, not the technical stuff. That's almost irrelevant. And I did all that. It was my job to do all that technical stuff. So I know pretty well what I'm talking about with regard to that.
Just bear with me. Just remind you, I don't know if you've ever heard of what are the Eskimos' definition of the future. Eskimos' definition of the future, they talk about the immediate future, the middle future, the far in the future, and the future that never comes.
That's nice. Classification.